What a very obedient class. We're doing well. It's my pleasure to introduce the new session chair for here. We have a Navy Captain, Captain Andrew McKinnon, obviously retired, but he is the Pres of the National Historical Society Victorian Chapter. Naval? What did I go for?
National.
Oh, okay. That's close though, isn't it? My apologies for that. Andrew, if you would please take over and sort us out. I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I'm delighted to be able to introduce our first speaker, a good friend, but also a fellow naval officer in many ways, Captain Ainsley Moorthorpe, CSM RAN. Ainsley is currently the commanding officer of HMAS Service down at Westernport, but I'll keep his introduction short because it's in the notes, but I would like to draw out the fact that he has had extensive experience in command in the Navy. He was one of the entrants to the Australian Defence Force Academy in 1986, first entry, but subsequently qualified as a mine warfare specialist, a principal warfare specialist. He commanded the patrol boat Fremantle out of Darwin. He then worked in Northern Command in Darwin and then commanded the naval base in Darwin at HMAS Coonawarra. Subsequently, he commanded again at sea in our supply ship then, HMAS Success, and subsequently has had two further shore commands. Firstly at HMAS Stirling over in Western Australia, Fleet Base West, and currently, as I just mentioned, at HMAS Service. So in many senses, Ainsley has had a quite unique experience within Navy, having had 5 commands, 2 at sea and 3 ashore, and I'm deeply envious. Ainsley, would you please come and talk to us?
Thanks, Andrew, and it's great to be here again. This is a reprise of a talk that I gave about 12 months ago with the Naval Historical Association, and I was asked to come back with a condensed version of it. That turned out to be the hardest part of this, trying to condense that down, and it's still very long. So I'm very conscious that I have little time, and I'm going to try and rip through this as fast as I can. Okay. I'm talking today about the 19th century experiences, the imperial experiences of the maritime thinkers in what we now call Australia, but the previous colonies. The influence was of those people who were in the colonies during that 19th century period was really driven by that grand strategic thinking of the British diaspora that had settled in Australia. And I'm going to finish up the talk by talking about how some of those influences shaped who became Admiral Creswell, and how the formation of the Royal Australian Navy came out of that thinking from that 19th century period. That period is marked through the 19th century that was shaped very much that we were, the British was our homeland. We were shaped by the intellectual deference to the notions that Britain would always remain the dominant sea power worldwide. And there was a historian called Gregory Mellish who described this strategic consciousness as being entrenched in the meta-narrative of empire. This meta-narrative of empire gave rise to a series of what I would now refer to as biases, most notably a conservatism bias, which significantly influenced the decision makers of the time, shaping the debates about how best to defend Australia. The assessment of the threats to Australia's sovereignty and wealth were largely viewed through this bifocal lens of this idea that the Royal Navy's dominance would drive everything and we didn't need to worry about it, but also the perspectives of what I would describe as the parsimonious colonial governments, which grew more conflicted through the economic booms of the time in the mid to the late 19th century, which then drove the discussions about what that suitable form for defence for the colonies would look like. I'm also going to look at the biases prevalent amongst the majority of the colonists themselves and their leaders who perceived Australia as being girt by beach. These biases were challenged by advocates for an Australian Navy with the focus on the experiences of people like William Creswell, as I said, during that 19th century period. Creswell, through a combination of various arguments, contended that Australia's threats would manifest on the oceans and along the sea lines of communication, from which our nation derived its great wealth. He argued that Australia required a blue water navy to safeguard its interests. Furthermore, he also believed that the geostrategic centre of gravity of Britain, and by extension the Admiralty, would largely influence their actions despite rhetoric from the UK. Australia could not rely on the British perspective to align with the perceived risks identified by the Australian colony or the Commonwealth. Creswell's girt by sea perspective played a significant role in shaping the preconditions for the development of a blue water Australian Navy in the earlier 20th century. At the onset of settlement, two key factors influenced local thinking. First, the concept of the tyranny of distance instilled a strong sense of isolation in the community here. Second was this unwavering faith in the defensive capabilities of the British Navy, coexisting with growing concerns about the colonial activities of other European powers and the potential risk to the sovereignty posed by Asian migration into a very sparsely populated land. Perversely, it was this unshakable faith in the Royal Navy's dominance and the might of the Empire that impeded the critical analysis required to understand the vulnerability of the nation's security. During the early 19th century, the British and the Admiralty were entangled in various forms of conflict amongst imperial powers and the tumultuous upheaval of independence movements reacting to the decay of control by European guardians. As colonies began to emerge on the Australian landmass, local governors started to develop a uniquely Australian worldview. However, this view remained fundamentally anchored in the British geostrategic structure, albeit from the local perception of this tyranny of distance which was in play from the beginning. Governors were acutely aware of the challenges of defending a landmass so vast that it could take weeks for a sailing ship to traverse the country. While Australians considered themselves culturally British, the geographic isolation of the Australian settlement led to an understandable divergence from London and the Admiralty regarding security concerns. By the mid-19th century, debates were beginning to centre around how Australian communities would fit into this larger empire, and we heard about that earlier in our first talk. The writer Stuart Ward introduced a concept called the communities of interest to describe the thinking of the colonies during the mid-19th century. New South Wales Governor William Dennison stressed the importance of a great power as exemplified by the Royal Navy in providing defence for Australia. Ward argued that the strategic thinking of the colonies from the mid-19th century would always be understood in the context of the particular needs of Australia's empire. Recognising the changing strategic status of the colony and its location in the Western Pacific, the British Admiralty established an independent command in 1859, initially under a Commodore, later a Vice Admiral after 1902, to oversee the Australia station based out of Sydney. This transition was arguably driven by the increasing value of Australia to the UK, rather than an acknowledgement of any existential threat to the colony. In his 2021 PhD thesis, the author Samuel Webster highlighted three key qualities of Australian strategic imagination during this mid to the late 19th century. Firstly, there was this prevailing belief that the British Empire and the Admiralty were so powerful that they would deter any existential threats in this remote part of the world. Second, colonial responses to these perceived threats revolved around what is now referred to as, we in the Navy call it, same by design, different by necessity. This manifested as a push to develop an independent land and sea force to supplement the empire from an Australian geostrategic perspective. Finally, the colony's geographic location was closer to their perceived threats than at the heart of the empire itself. We were closer to the things that worried us than the British were. Even in the earliest days of British imperial concerns and settlement, there was a growing realisation that the experiences of those who were settling this vast continent would shape the discussions on the required response to local concerns. In late 1826, Governor-General Ralph Darling, contrary to the experienced Royal Navy officer Captain James Stirling's advice, sent a party led by Major Edmund Lockyer to establish an outpost around King George's Sound. Darling's approach to grand strategy reflected a continentalist's appreciation of maritime power, which stemmed from his experiences commanding the 51st Light Infantry Regiment during the Peninsular War. This approach contributed to a complacent view that it was inconceivable for Australia to face an existential threat while the Royal Navy remained supreme, and the proof of those holding this view was that the Australian landmass was indeed never invaded. The first significant steps towards an independent maritime force were initiated by the self-governing colony of Victoria. Lieutenant Governor Latrobe, alarmed by the lack of focus on the security of the substantial amounts of gold being stored and shipped out of the colony, ordered the construction of the modern steam-powered sloop, the HM colonial steamship Victoria. In the first decade of Victoria's existence, they shipped 21,500,000 ounces of gold, which would be the equivalent to over $30 billion in today's currency. Arguably, this view was driven by more of a fear of piracy and disruption to trade than a risk to sovereignty. The first geostrategic shock came during the lead up to and during the Crimean War, with concerns about Russian ships sortying from Vladivostok into the Pacific and endangering trade routes. Some colonists feared a direct attack from Russia. Governor Denison's strategic thinking in the fort in Sydney Harbour that bears his name served as a reminder of Australia's deep-seated connection to imperial causes, but also as a vestige of settler colonial anxieties about imperial defence. At this point, doubts began to emerge about the Royal Navy's ability to come to Australia's aid, as the colonists were troubled by the realisation that what had happened to the original inhabitants when the British arrived could just as easily happen to them. Creswell was born in Gibraltar during this period, and there were still people alive in Australia who remembered the very earliest days of settlement, along with a profound sense of isolation from the UK. Throughout the mid to late 19th century, a growing fear developed that a hostile foreign force could easily overwhelm local defences and seize sovereignty over parts of the continent, as was happening in other parts of the world. The strategic risk was that a small population in a vast country could not effectively defend everywhere. The debate in the colonies began to focus on the form this defence should take. There was general agreement that Australia would always need to rely on the UK and the Royal Navy to provide a guarantee against sovereign and existential threats. However, this reliance was tempered by a growing unease that the UK's strategic outlook might not always align with the increasingly independent perspectives of the colonies. During this time, William Creswell joined the Royal Navy in 1865 at the age of 13. His early years in the Navy afforded him a broad view of the British Empire, witnessing inter-imperial rivalry and experiencing the reach of the Royal Navy, but also seeing how thin they were spread out. He visited Australia in late 1869 after serving in various capacities, including suppressing the slave trade in East Africa and fighting pirates off Malaya and in Chinese waters. He left the Royal Navy and emigrated with his brother to Australia in 1878. He initially intended to become a pastoralist in the great tradition of officers leaving the Navy who go off to run farms, which generally fail. He initially intended to become a pastoralist, but came primed with an understanding of the issues and concerns that Australians faced during this latter part of the 19th century, along with a sound comprehension of the capabilities and the limitations of the Royal Navy. From the late 1880s, the colonies began to perceive their growing role in the empire and their obligation to demonstrate their strategic capability. They felt the need to contribute to broader efforts to maintain the empire. This sense of responsibility was linked to the conviction that they needed to prove their worth to the Crown by ensuring their own defence and participating in the Empire's strategic interests. After the British garrison was withdrawn in 1870, the colonies increased their financial and personal commitment to the defence of their territories to ensure British engagement in their strategic affairs. For example, New South Wales sent a contingent to the Sudan War in 1885. In 1865, the British Parliament ratified the Colonial Defence Act, which was agreed upon by the colonies. This act recognised the growing local demand for increased security against perceived threats. New South Wales and Victoria were the first to acquire sovereign naval forces, which they obtained with generous British subsidies. The purchase price was just one part of the cost of owning and operating warships, with the colonies covering the expenses of maintaining, repairing and operating these new ships. The Admiralty provided the sole docking and refit base in the country in Sydney, a critical supply to capability to support these larger warships. These colonial ships, however, were smaller and less capable than the Royal Navy's larger blue water cruisers. This period was marked by rapid technological advancements that quickly rendered older warships obsolete. Maintaining and operating these more capable ships was considerably more expensive. Consequently, a significant number of the local politicians balked at the idea of running such a fleet, arguing that there was no benefit to building colonial cruisers while the Royal Navy managed the Australia Squadron. In the late 19th century, there was a growing view among colonial and British authorities that it was worthwhile to establish a single Australian Defence Force, albeit under the command of imperial officers. This idea was shaped by the view of some British officers and even a few colonial officers who regarded their colonial counterparts unfavourably. There was also a negative perception of the work culture of a colonial seaman, particularly after an experiment by the Commander-in-Chief of the Australia Squadron, Admiral Tryon, in 1885. He attempted to have colonialists crew an armed merchant cruiser in response to a Russian scare. However, the colonial seaman posted to the newly refitted Lusitania refused to work under a Royal Navy officer and demanded colonial rates of pay, leaving a negative impression on the Admiralty and even the sympathetic observer like Admiral Tryon. Ex-Royal Navy officers who emigrated to Australia in the late 19th century brought their experiences to bear on maritime grand strategy. They combined their fundamental knowledge of the United Kingdom structure, the security it provided to the emerging colonies, and their views on self-sufficiency. Despite a growing chorus of national commentators advocating for an Australian Navy, the Admiralty and even many colonial leaders maintained a strong view that the colonies were ill-equipped to manage a blue water fleet. This scepticism was rooted in concerns about the professionalising of the officer corps, the perceived amateurish nature of the sailors, and the insular strategic perspectives of the government, and the prohibitive costs of running such a fleet. Operational considerations also shaped this debate, particularly regarding control of a local fleet and its state of readiness. The Australian Naval Squadron, while partially subsidised by the Australian colonies, remained under control of the Admiralty. The cruisers based in Sydney might not be used locally if the Admiralty considered events elsewhere to be a higher priority or disagreed with local risk assessments. Queensland's annexation of New Guinea in 1883 to prevent a German annexation, which ran contrary to the British view at the time, exemplified the growing concerns of the colonial premiers about the expanding imperial activities in the Pacific. This situation, along with further great power competition such as the Japanese invasion of Formosa and the war between the United States and Spain in the Philippines, alarmed colonial leaders, who nonetheless continued to support the agreement to maintain the Australia Squadron. In 1885, while visiting Adelaide, Creswell met an old shipmate, Commander John Walcott, Commandant of the South Australian Naval Forces. Walcott offered him an appointment as a Lieutenant Commander, and Creswell accepted the offer, becoming the first Lieutenant of Her Majesty's colonial ship Protector. It was during this period that the Creswell's strategic thinking started to formulate the idea that the solution to the risk of the Royal Navy being committed to the defence of the Empire, rather than the colony, was for Australia to develop adequate naval forces to supplement the Royal Navy Squadron based in Sydney. Around the same time, Admiral Sir George Tryon, who was one of the more sympathetic commanders-in-chief of the Australian Squadron, spent 2 years in the colony. In 1886, Tryon argued that the colonial governments needed to explore ways to augment their naval forces to better cooperate in maritime affairs and to develop a degree of local autonomy. He believed that unless the colonies owned and operated their ships independently, they would never fully grasp the true costs involved. His discussions with the colonial governments laid the groundwork for a future autonomous force, more than for merely local defence. The Jubilee Conference of 1887 resulted in a compromise, with the Admiralty and the British government against the parsimonious colonial governments. I keep on saying that word, I'll quickly explain what I mean by that. The colonial governments were notorious at not committing to the amounts of money that was actually required to run these fleets, partly because they actually knew the British would keep on funding it themselves, and partly because they just didn't understand why you needed to spend that amount of money on running these fleets. I was about to make a political comment, but I won't. This agreement maintained that the Australia Squadron at full strength and stipulated that the British would fund most of the auxiliary squadron crewed by colonial sailors, but officered by British or British trained officers. While it would operate under the direct control of the British Commander-in-Chief, it would retain a significant level of autonomy in certain prescribed operations in the region. Creswell's thinking was also undoubtedly influenced by the rise of Australian nationalism during the 1890s. Although he remained in South Australia as a commander and then captain during this period, Creswell actively participated in national discussions about how this newfound nationalism should manifest in a maritime context. There was still tremendous pride in being a part of the British Empire, but a growing view that British geostrategic imperatives were becoming divergent to the needs of the colony and did not represent their sovereign views on how to deal with regional risks. The Admiralty's doctrine of naval concentration, for example, whereby British ships supposedly protecting the colony would be diverted to where the Admiralty perceived the enemy centre of gravity to be, concerned the colonial leaders who were beginning to appreciate that this assessment of the British centre of gravity might not align with their own. As the late 19th century drew to a close, arguments in favour of a sovereign Australian Navy became stronger, but the specific form that it should take remained a matter of debate. On the one hand was the view that, in matters of existential threat to the colony, that they could not possibly afford to raise a sufficient force to make any appreciable difference, and as such it made complete sense to throw in their lot with the British. The counter view was that the British would not always respond to a local threat in a manner to which the colonial governments expected. The Admiralty was debating this point with men such as Rear Admiral Beaumont, the Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Squadron, who in 1901, after Federation, wrote, "The one point upon which they, the Australians, seemed unwilling to enter was the release of the Admiralty from the obligation of keeping the ships in Australian waters at all times. They knew that clause in the agreement had been held to be of much importance by the Premiers at the London Conference of 1897, and they were not inclined to alter or disturb it. I believe that, as long as any contribution is accepted, this condition will be demanded. The ministers thought that in time of war, the request to take the ships beyond the limits of the station would be readily granted, but I do not think so, as long as there appeared to be any risk of attack from stray vessels of the country." End quote. The Colonial Conference of 1902 produced a naval agreement that provided for a financial subsidy and the acceptance of Australians as sailors, but not officers, in the Royal Navy ships stationed on the Australia Station. Creswell criticised this approach, calling it a rent-a-navy scheme, echoing the concerns of the Australian government. The Admiralty conscientiously opposed the idea of an Australian Navy, believing that a small navy would be inefficient, unprofessional, and prohibitively expensive, and thus become quickly obsolete. As an example, by this stage, the world-leading design of the Cerberus, the Monitor, was completely obsolete, and it was costing a huge amount of money to maintain. In fact, the ship had been sitting alongside for years because they didn't have the money to refit its boilers. The Admiralty's views contrasted with those of many Australian leaders who increasingly saw the need for a local naval force. The momentum for the development of an Australian Navy grew stronger over the first decade of the 20th century. The Admiralty eventually acknowledged Australia's defence needs in light of the deteriorating international situation, and orders for new vessels to create an independent Australian fleet were placed. Creswell argued that this fleet was necessary to secure trade in Australian waters and that it would force an enemy to dispatch a significant force to counter it effectively. This fleet would enable Australians to patrol its own sea lines of communication and hold a major expeditionary force at bay while still waiting for the Royal Navy to arrive. On the 10th of July 1911, King George V granted the title of Royal Australian Navy to the Permanent Commonwealth Naval Forces. This became effective on the 5th of October 1911 when Australian ships began flying the British White Ensign. Rear Admiral Creswell became the first naval member of the Royal Australian Navy. From 1913, this newly established Royal Australian Navy fleet was an integrated part of the Empire's strategic strength. Australia's grand strategic goal was to maximise its sovereign freedom of action as a nation-state. In a grand strategic sense, Australia's freedom of action depended on preserving sole sovereignty over its continent, as all existential threats and serious risks came from or over the sea. The experiences of colonial mariners in the 19th century, combined with the visionary efforts of individuals like Creswell, played a pivotal role in the development of the Royal Australian Navy during the first decade of the 20th century. This transformation turned the Australian Navy from a collection of obsolescent vessels into a professional and world-class fighting force. While the path was challenging, the foresight of individuals like Creswell and Deakin was richly rewarded in 1914, when the powerful German East Asiatic Squadron was deterred from implementing its plans for cruiser warfare in the Pacific. In the words of Prime Minister Billy Hughes, the great cities of Australia would have been reduced to ruins, coastwise shipping sunk, and communications with the outside world cut off, if it weren't for the efforts of the Australian Navy. The establishment of the Royal Australian Navy marked a significant shift from being a subsidiary of the Royal Navy to a fully fledged and sovereign capability. The Navy became a national endeavour that involved various aspects of government and society. When it became clear that the grand strategy of the major Allied powers would result in the ceding of Australian sovereignty, the independent Navy, along with the Army and Air Force, returned to fight in what was arguably the closest thing to an existential conflict Australia has ever experienced. This shift in alliance and dependence from the British to another grand power during the Second World War would not have been possible without individuals like Creswell, who recognised the grand strategic imperative for Australia and set the preconditions for the nation's success in that second existential conflict. Thank you very much.
Captain, perfect timing, well done.
There you go.
Questions? Sure, there must be a few. Yes.
Just a question. Did Queensland's annexation of Papua call into question the British strategy of devolving power to the colonies? Because then they might go and use that power to do things the British didn't like.
Definitely, and it also happened in New Caledonia. It happened in a bunch of different areas. So there was this idea that the British would make deals with other great powers without consulting or even thinking about the concerns of the colonial governments at the time. The big push, as I talked about in the discussion there, was the view that in Victoria, for example, and New South Wales, the amount of money that was being generated out of this country, it really frightened them, because they had this view that the whole world would just suddenly come pouring down on them to either disrupt their trade, to steal and act as pirates, or to set up their own colonies, which would be allowing them then to exploit part of this national wealth as well. So the fear of the colonial governments at the time was that the British would cut a deal without asking them first about what their views were. So, for example, the Germans going into New Guinea and the French going into New Caledonia really alarmed them, because they were not happy with that, because they liked the status quo prior to that, which was essentially that the British ran the whole Pacific. So, yes, it did scare them. Does that answer your question?
It was more about, did the British question their policy of devolving power to colonies?
I also think the British were cranky with the fact that Queensland did that annexation, and as we heard in the first talk, there was genuinely a fear that yes, that the Australians would go off and do something counter to the views of what the Admiralty or the British government were thinking at the time, because they were thinking about the entire world, and we were thinking about our region. So yes, there was a big fear, I think, from the readings that I've done.
Thanks very much for that. You mentioned Creswell and Deakin, who, if I remember rightly, got on pretty famously. How did Creswell get on with the rising Labor Party, which would, in the end, steer Australian defence policy on the eve of the First World War?
And you've just taken me right out of my comfort zone, because I haven't. How could I answer that question? There was a lot of nationalistic talk going on at the time, ranging from there to no, we need to stick with the British all the way. My view was that Creswell came with a very pragmatic view of that British power. Having spent all that time in the Royal Navy himself, having done all these amazing things around the world, he would have been acutely aware that yes, the Royal Navy was everywhere, but the major battle fleets weren't necessarily anywhere nearby. So I think that Creswell's understanding of a pragmatic view of what a navy should look like in this region aligned with, I think, that sense of nationalism which was starting to rise, particularly in the 1890s. So my assumption would be that I think he would have recognised that they were allies in his cause. Not necessarily, I don't know about his political views, but I certainly know that...
but just how they got on.
Yeah, and I just think it was an alignment of all the different things. I mean, there was this push also from various different colonial leaders that we didn't need this simply because of the amount of money that was going to be involved in this sort of stuff. We can see it now. I mean, one of the things that strikes me when I wrote this was nothing's changed. The amount of money that's being talked about now, these are really sovereign issues here. A navy is an incredibly expensive thing. So I think most of the time it was an argument between the pragmatists of people like Creswell and aligned with the nationalistic views of the various political leaders at the time, which was coinciding with this idea, no, we need to have our own, primarily because then we can control what they do. I mean, there was things like this, the auxiliary squadron that was created to support the Australia squadron. I know it's confusing. The Australia squadron was the Royal Navy. The auxiliary squadron, which was being created in the late 19th century with the cruisers, they were actually pushing towards armed merchant cruisers like the Lusitania. That view there was that those ships were going to be there and would be controlled by the Australian government, as opposed to the Australia squadron, which, as I talked about, could be sent anywhere at any particular time. So I think that sense of nationalism combined with that pragmatism would have brought those two types of characters together, and certainly Deakin and all those folks that were arguing for sovereignty would have aligned very perfectly with Creswell's view.
As when you mentioned other imperial powers potentially sticking around Australia and seeing a good opportunity, trying to put the Russian interest in that timeline and the context. When was that? Because anecdotally, the forts down here were built to protect us from Russian warships, but I'm just trying to work out where that all fits in.
Honestly, I just didn't have time to actually go through. It was a question that I asked as well, because there seemed to be multiple Russian scares all the way through that 60-year period.
Okay.
So it started off with the Crimean War and the view that there would be ships coming out of Vladivostok, but there were more scares. Like, for example, that one in 1880 that I talk about, I didn't have time to find out what that was. Someone in this room may know what that scare was. But I saw multiple references to Russian scares over that whole period. Even down where I am, I mean, there used to be there was a railway line taken down to Stony Point into inside Western Port Bay. Don't quote me on the date, but it was about 1880 something or other, around about that period of time. So there was a railway line down there, primarily because they had an artillery battery down there, primarily because they worried that Russians were coming into Western Port Bay. I can't remember the nationality. There was a warship that was actually in Western Port Bay for 2 days before that railway line went down there, and nobody knew about it up in Melbourne. No one had any idea that the ship was there, which scared the Victorian government a lot at the time, which is why they built that railway line down there not long afterwards. So there were multiple scares, but it wasn't just them. I mean, it was interesting to talk about the Germans and the annexations. I mean, I actually lived in Western Samoa as a kid growing up, so I'm acutely aware of the imperial rivalries that were going on in the 1880s. So there was the very famous incident of the HMS Calliope, which is the steamship that sailed out of Apia Harbour as a hurricane came in and destroyed the fleet of American and German ships. The British were there as a peacekeeping force, which was part of their role as the Australia squadron, but there were 4 German frigates and 4 American frigates without steam power, and they all saw the warning signs that this hurricane was coming for days prior, And it's a classic example of how humans can be just incredibly bloody minded and stupid, because they sat there knowing that this hurricane was coming, but neither the Americans or the Germans wanted to leave because they were worried that if they left, these guys would then annex Samoa. The Calliope sat there watching the whole thing. The hot cyclone hit, all of the frigates got washed up on the rocks and the Calliope sailed out, and now there's a dock in Auckland Harbour called the Calliope Dock, which was built in 1888. That dock was built in 1888 before the docking facilities in Sydney, but that was designed to take, at the time, some of the largest warships that existed. It wasn't until World War II, when the graving dock in Garden Islands in Sydney was built, that we actually had a dock that was bigger than that. So I do talk about the Australia Squadron having docking facilities in Sydney, but it was nothing as impressive as what was in Auckland in 1888.
As a quick comment, if I may, the Russian scares were often driven by the Anglo-Russian rivalry over Afghanistan, and people often got that in their heads. This was the thing. But how those coal-driven ships were going to go from Vladivostok to Melbourne without reloading the coal, no one actually.
That's actually, I'm conscious of time, but I will hit on that thing about the coal. That's actually something I didn't put in my talk because I didn't think I was going to have enough time. One of the reasons why the Admiralty was so dead set against the idea that the Australians needed their own fleet was because of coal in the late 19th century, because they controlled all the coaling stations around that region. So their argument, quite rightly, was the only way to get such a large fleet to get down and do an existential threat to Australia would be to somehow or other seize all these coaling stations, and the British would know about that. And their argument was coal was the limiting factor there. Then, of course, oil came in the late 19th century, so that argument started to become less important.
Maisie, thank you very much. I mean, you started me thinking. Yeah, go on. When did telegraphy come in, and how quickly could messages be conveyed between London and the British ships out here? And I think it was about the mid-late 1850s anyway. But I mean, communications from London to that to the British ships station was. Thank you very much for a wonderful dissertation. Please accept that small gift. Thank you very much.